It's time to take your business to the next level, the boss level. These are the premier business owner strategies and successes being utilized by the industry's top talent today. Rock your business like a boss, a VO boss. Now let's welcome your host, Ann Ganguza.
Hola, Boss Voces. Bienvenidos al podcast con Ann Ganguza y Pilar Uribe.
Hey everyone, welcome to the VO Boss Podcast. I'm your host, Ann Ganguza, and I am so excited to be back again with my very special guest co-host, Pilar Uribe. Hey Pilar, how are you today?
I am doing great, Ann. How are you?
I'm doing awesome this beautiful morning. Hey, I got a question for you. I have a lot of students that ask me about the union and should they be part of the union and when is the time for them to join the union. And I also have another student who's going to be moving to California and they're asking these questions about the union. So I think it would be a great time to talk about it with you because I know that you are a union member and I'd like to kind of do a here's the Union 101 kind of class in the podcast today. So I know there's a lot of people out there that have questions. And tell me a bit about how you joined the union.
Well, I have a long history with the union. I started out actually in New York because I got extra work on One Life to Live back when there were a lot of soap operas. And basically the day that I walked into the area where the holding room where you have all the extras sit, this very nice person stuck out her hand and said, "Hi, I'm so-and-so, a member of AFTRA, the local representative." And I thought, oh, this is interesting. So literally I had not stepped foot on a soundstage in New York when there was somebody already basically saying to me, "This is an offer you can't refuse." And so, yeah, because it's like you don't really have a choice. You have to become a member of the union.
You got to join here.
Right. Yeah, exactly. So I did. I joined happily. And I actually did a lot of extra work with the different soap operas in New York. And then when I went to Colombia, they don't have unions down there. They didn't. Now they are starting to. They do have something together.
Let me just back up. You were in New York. At what time, what year was it that you joined the union in New York?
Oh, gosh. This was the 90s.
Okay.
This was in the 90s. And this is when, because AFTRA is not just, everybody thinks of AFTRA as just radio, but AFTRA was
that's what
also,
I remember.
Yeah, AFTRA's also TV.
But not all TV, though, right?
But not all TV, exactly.
Okay.
I want to say that AFTRA might just be daytime TV, or it was daytime TV, or maybe it was like
Plus
game
radio.
shows and stuff like that. Yeah.
Yeah, because when I got into the industry, it was all AFTRA. There's no SAG. There was all AFTRA for voice actors. That's what you were supposed to join. And then they merged at some point later on.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And actually, AFTRA stands for the American Federation of Television and Radio Artists.
Yes.
So that tells you right there that it was specifically for some forms of television. I'm not really sure back then what the distinction was, but SAG and AFTRA were completely separate unions.
So you were in New York, and you were an AFTRA member in the 90s. And then you went to Colombia, and you were on television in Colombia, but there is, no unions.
No unions. But I kept my AFTRA card anyway because I thought, you never know. And the dues were very, very low, so I kept it. I kept it up. And then I came back to,
right?
Thank goodness. Yes.
Because you were in Colombia for, 8 years, right?
9 years.
9 years, so a while. So I like that manifestation that you never know, right, when you're going to need that card again.
Yes,
or that
exactly.
status.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. All right.
And the dues back then were very, they were very reasonable, so it wasn't a big deal. So I come back to Miami because I decide I want to be halfway between Bogota and New York.
And that was in the 2000s, right?
That was in the 2000s, early
Yep.
2000s. And then I discovered that Miami is a right-to-work state.
So let's talk about that. Let's define that first. What is a right-to-work state?
Okay, so the actual definition of a right-to-work state is that states have the authority to determine whether workers can be required to join a labor union to get or keep a job. So labor unions still operate in those states, but workers, they can't be forced to become members as a requirement of their job, which they do have to be, let's say, in New York or Los Angeles. If you want to work on a soundstage,
Right. You have to be in
you
the
have
union.
to be a member of the union. Yeah. And they're very strict with that. And I remember when I worked in television in the times that I did extra work, it was so interesting to be on the soundstage and, for example, the coordinator, the guy who yells 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. One time the director was already in the booth and the actors were on stage, and the guy went to move the plate and he was not allowed to because a member of the prop union had to come over and move the plate 2 inches forward. They're very, very strict about that, and for good reason, because the unions are there to protect the workers.
Exactly.
And what each person's job is. So when I got to Miami, I started auditioning and I started getting non-union jobs, and I was happy with that. And I remember hearing union actors complain, saying once they became union, then there weren't as many possibilities.
Because there was other people vying for the same roles, right?
Yes, exactly. And there was so much competition. And so a non-union actor could vie for a union job. Whereas in other states like California, Los Angeles, you had to be union. So I kept booking work, and I was fine with that. And I was booking on camera work at that time.
Did people try to convince you to join the union? Were you offered?
No, because Florida is a little bit like the Wild West. Back then it was. And so there was nobody compelling. No, there was nobody showing up at the door saying, you gotta join. No, not like in New York.
Right.
And so one day I got a call from my agent and she said, you booked a SAG commercial. And I thought, oh, okay, this is cool. And it's so interesting, the world of non-union versus union. Because I did a ton of extra work in New York on films. And so I think I mentioned that before. Like I basically touched Arnold Schwarzenegger's sleeve. And then one time I was in this Michael J. Fox film and we were in a theater. It was just hordes of non-union extras sitting in the seats. And then there's this altercation and then James Woods comes and I don't know what he does. And literally he had a cowboy boot on. I'll never forget it. And he stepped on my foot. And so we did like 4 takes, and every time he went and he stepped exactly on my foot. I mean, he my foot was his mark. So wild. And I've actually, it's so funny because I've looked at that scene, and you can't really see me. You can see my jacket, and you can see me for like a second, but I'm like, yep, that's the day that I got a bruise that covered my foot for about a week. Oh my gosh, it was so painful. But I was so excited because, James Woods stepped on my foot 5 times.
Stepped on your foot, absolutely.
Right. It was interesting. And I also did extra work on Law and Order. And they treated the union actors very differently from the way they treated the non-union actors. And I remember thinking, wow, they get like extra candy bars. And, right? And they get like special food. And it's a whole different world. And they were all in cliques, and they would bring their board games and their jigsaw puzzles. And they would, because, you're basically waiting all day to do something. And the time that you work is so little. But I just remember looking at them going, wow, that's such a cool world. And, it's the world of waiting. It's like you're just basically a waiter. You wait and you wait. So I did a whole bunch of those in New York. And then I started doing more non-union principal work. And then when I got this SAG commercial, I was treated like a queen. I couldn't believe it. I was like, usually you go, when you're an extra, you go and you bring your own clothes and they look at your clothes and you put your own makeup on and they treat you a little bit like cattle. I mean, the people are nice, the PAs are nice, but you're just basically shuffled off into a room and then they, it's food and whatever. When you're like, as a union person, and I didn't even have a speaking part. It was a really, really fun thing. We were just all these characters in like this little mini play of an office. And my makeup was done, my hair was done. They kept fiddling with my outfit. And I was just like, wow, this is what it's like to be in the union. And at that point, I wasn't a member of the union. So that was a really special moment. This was like my first SAG on-camera commercial. It was like the big leagues because I had done that extra work on daytime TV that was AFTRA back in New York. But this felt really, really special. And so, I don't know, maybe a couple months after that, I received a letter.
I was going to say, you did the commercial, the SAG commercial, and then they asked you to join?
Yes.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Yes. And then they asked me to join. And
Was it a requirement? It was a requirement?
nope, because a lot of the times what happens is, let's say you're an extra, and then you get upgraded to a principal.
Mm-hmm.
That happens a lot, and that's how people become members of the union. That's how it used to be. Now it's a lot more tightly controlled, but that's how a lot of people used to get their SAG cards. So I received that letter, and I wasn't a member of the SAG union when I did the commercial.
Right. But they treated you so nicely, and then you said, wow,
yes.
I want that again.
Exactly.
I get that.
I want to get my hair and makeup done.
I
It was
want
so much
hair
fun.
and makeup, and
Yeah. I mean, I was really spoiled in Colombia because, I would go to work pretty much every day because I worked 4 or 5 days a week. And so I would just go home with my makeup and I would go out. And so, it had been so long when I was back in the States that it was just nice. I was like, oh, wow, this could be really fun to have this on a regular basis. And I decided I wasn't ready to join the union because it was expensive to join it.
So AFTRA wasn't necessarily costly, but SAG was a different story back then?
Yes, SAG was a different story. Yeah, yeah, because the initiation dues for AFTRA were so low when I joined. But SAG was, it was a big deal. And what was going to happen was that then I couldn't do any non-union work.
Exactly.
Then I start getting into voiceover.
Mm-hmm.
And then I find that there's a lot of voiceover dubbing going on. So I start going to all these different studios.
So bring me up to date as to what year. Have they merged yet? Because, by the way,
Nope,
bosses,
they
in
have
case
not.
you're not familiar, SAG and AFTRA did merge.
This is like 2010.
Okay.
Where I start working in voiceover and I start going to the different studios.
And you're a member of both unions?
No, I'm still a member of AFTRA.
Oh, that's right. Excuse me, AFTRA, but not SAG. Yep.
I'm not a member of SAG.
Got it.
And then I don't see anything in the bylaws that I can't do this, so I just keep doing voiceover. I get a little worried because I don't know if this goes against it, but I checked one time with a friend and they said, no, you can do this. And I was like, okay, great. Wonderful. And it was literally the only game in town. So then SAG and AFTRA merged. And I believe, I want to say they merged in 2014, around there, maybe 2012, 2014.
I think it was 2014.
2014, yeah, that sounds right. Yeah. So one day I got a notice saying, you are now a member of SAG-AFTRA. And I was like, oh, okay. So.
Oh, no. Let's see. I'm just looking. It formed on March 30th, 2012. Look at me. Does that make sense?
Yeah, because it says here that they were suspended in 2014. But yeah, you're right. Founded 2012. So that means that
on my birthday.
Now on your birthday. Oh, well, there
March
you go.
30th, my birthday. Yeah, there
March
you go.
30th.
A
What
special
are you?
occasion.
Is that a Pisces?
Aries. Aries.
Aries.
Yeah.
Okay.
Sorry, there was a little tangent there, bosses. So.
I'm a Gemini, by the way.
Okay.
So there you go. There you go. Gemini and Aries voiceovers. So now I'm a member of the union. And now I start going, this is now getting tricky. What do I do? And that's when I actually decided, I thought, okay, well, let me see about doing audiobooks. Because I was not getting enough work through the dubbing because it doesn't pay very well. Years pass and I am still doing dubbing.
So it got hard to find work, being a member, right? Being a member of both unions, it got hard where you were living to find more work. And that was in Florida, correct? So it was hard to find work for you? Mm-hmm.
Now, it was hard to find work on camera because I wasn't really tapped into the voiceover industry per se when I started. I was really more focused on camera. In Florida, there is no union voiceover work because it is a right-to-work state. There might be, but I didn't see any when I was there. I was always going for what was around, and you worked with different studios, and you could do commercials and stuff, but they never talked about union per se. Other people might have had different experiences, but
I want to kind of bring this back that this was, I feel like it was a different time.
it was.
Before the internet, right? We're still talking before the advent of online anything, right? Where today we have abilities and opportunities everywhere. Because back in the day, right, when you had a voiceover job, you went to a studio and you did that. It wasn't where you could live, in one state and connect to the studio, well, until the 2000s, right? And connect to a studio in LA. So there's all sorts of interesting technological advancements that have maybe changed the way the landscape of union, non-union jobs availability.
Exactly.
Because now if you were in Florida, you could still, I feel like you'd have opportunities for union jobs because now we have technologies that allow us to connect to studios that are in different states.
And the pandemic has changed a lot too.
Yeah.
It's almost like it's brought the world closer because it's just so much more accessible.
Yeah.
I will tell you something interesting. Voice 123 was launched in 2003. But I don't think people knew about that.
I was part of Voice 123 when they first started. There was no union jobs posted on there.
Right. And you didn't go to the internet to go, you went to a studio to get work back then, right?
Back then, before all the pay-to-plays and before all the online casting sites, absolutely.
Exactly.
You would go record in a studio. As a matter of fact, when I first started in voiceover, it was not a requirement to have a home studio at all.
Of course.
That was like a thing that some people did, because they were, tech heads. And as we evolved with the home studio, it's so funny because it seems like just yesterday, but it was, it's like, wow, things have really progressed with technology and home studios and the landscape of how to get work in voiceover. And it really ties into this, how do you get work if you're in a right-to-work state? How can you, and you're part of the union, is there enough work? I've heard that even recently, that it's hard to get union work. I mean, where are the opportunities?
So here's the thing. What I discovered is, which is something that's more people know about it because it's basically word of mouth, is that you can convert non-union work to union. You can convert it.
Through
but
a
that's
paymaster.
Not something, through a paymaster, but it's not something that's necessarily advertised. So it all depends on rates. You have to be up on your rates. But one of the ways that I found it was through audiobooks. So I was able to, by having a paymaster, ACX used to have this. They've kind of done away with it now. It's not the same as when I started.
Oh, interesting.
The pie has been made smaller, let's put it that way. But you still can do work through ACX.
ACX, that's union?
Yeah, but also get yourself a paymaster. And on certain jobs, you can basically ask the client, can we do it this way? And it's possible. It's just, it is a little harder.
From Florida, you move to California. So now you're in a right-to-work state to California. And so how does it, and you're a member of the union, so how does it change when you move to California?
I actually spoke to members, people who worked at the union multiple times, saying to them, I would like to work as a union member, but I can't, not in this state. And they were very aware of this. And they said, yeah, we know. We know that we cannot have competitive pricing in a place like Florida. So they knew exactly what was going on. It was not like news to them. Because I said, I wanted to be upfront. I said, this was what happened to me. I was not a member of the union. I became a member of SAG because of SAG AFTRA, and I have to make a living. So when I came to California, I found that it was a lot easier because the structures were in place. Much more for union actors.
That makes sense.
It also helps having the agents that I do, and they are phenomenal. I was just really blessed to get the agents that I have. And
I was just going to say, and now with the added agencies that you're able to work with and the fact that you can work remotely can help now as well to increase the opportunities for union work.
Yes, because, Anne, when I lived in Florida, I was working all the time. But I would never have had the opportunity to audition for a McDonald's, for a Geico. Those just were not available to me. So there is something to be said. The union has its pluses and its minuses, but I will say that my decision to come here and work as a union actor has probably been the best decision that I ever made. Now, it's not for everyone. But having been on the other side, having been in a right to work state, it makes a huge difference.
Now, let's talk about it's not for everyone. Now, I will say, as someone who is non-union, for me, it really is just based on the genres that I get work in and the genres that I enjoy doing work in. So I would say, obviously, if there's anything broadcast, union is definitely a possibility. You do not have to, if you're a voice talent, you're just coming up in the ranks, you do not have to join the union right away. As a matter of fact, I think it behooves you to do some work, figure out where your niche is, and where you're successful at obtaining work and make the decision then. Because for me, I do a lot of non-union work, and for me, it works. Even though I live in a state that would benefit me if I decided to join the union and really, go for those genres that can pay off. And I would say that the really nice part about it, the advantage from my standpoint, is that you've got somebody that is on your team negotiating for you and making sure that you are getting paid fairly and equitably. Whereas non-union people, that's a lot of that is left to them, to their own devices, to make sure that you're getting paid fairly and equitably. But it's always nice to have somebody on your team fighting for you and having and establishing ground rules.
I agree. We as actors, we don't always have those negotiating skills, and I'm certainly not as good as I could be. I'm definitely better than I was. And when I was a member of Equity, which I've lapsed it because I'm not doing theater, it really came into play because they require that you have minimums, and they're very protective. And all the unions, that is their goal, that is their intent. And so that's something that I really appreciate in a vast sea and all this competition and all these people coming up to you and offering you this and offering you that, and then you find out, oh, whoops, that's a scam. So it really does depend on the genre that you plan to concentrate on. Yeah. And I will tell you this, me probably along with 100,000 other people have come to LA thinking, oh yeah, I really want to do animation, which I did, and I do. And I've probably done one thing. However, I've done a lot more commercial work, which I wasn't expecting to do because I thought I was going to get to do animation, and it's like, that's like the big joke because everyone and their mother wants to do it, and it's very hard and it's very competitive. And so I'm constantly improving myself, and I'm constantly working at it, and I'm doing my homework, like in the other sessions that we've talked about. And, surprisingly, for example, I've done some union video games. So that was not something that I was expecting because that's much more, they're more dramatic. And I've been exposed to other kinds of work that I had no idea about. I would never have done, I did a whole campaign last year that I would never have done if I had stayed in Miami. So becoming a union actor just really opens your vistas as to the possibilities. So
in specific genres, for sure.
In specific genres. Obviously, in e-learning and narration, that's something that doesn't conform to the union. So it doesn't make sense to be a union member if that is the bulk of your work.
Exactly.
So, it depends on location, and it depends on the kind of work that you want to do. I think that the decision to become a union actor is really up to the individual. It's not something that has to be done in a hurry or like FOMO, fear of missing out.
I agree.
It's something that has to be done strategically and...
Absolutely.
And when you're comfortable, because it will come with its ups and downs. This took me a period it was a very long time. This isn't just something that just happened and I decided. I mean, it was over a very long period of time that I made the decision. And so when you're comfortable, I think that that's when it's the right time to really look at it. Because I will say this, it has been amazing the past 2.5 years to be part of SAG AFTRA. Really and truly. And I feel so blessed. However, that said, I came into that. I grew into that moment. It wasn't something that I would just say, oh, yeah, join the union, or no, ew, don't join the union.
Exactly, because you were already a part of it. So you found the ways to make it really work to your advantage, I think, as well.
Exactly.
I think if you are just a voice talent and you're living in a right-to-work state, or you're doing your genres that you're doing the majority of your work in, they're not necessarily broadcast, you have some time to grow into it or see if it's something that you might want to get involved with. I think that there's definitely some pluses and there's definitely some things that you've got to think about. I know that You do get health benefits, but I think that that's been I'm going to say some negotiations happening there or some changes in the contract in the last couple of years that have not been positive.
But I will say this, that was one of the main reasons that I wanted to come here. And then they switched it, and then they raised the levels. But coming from somebody who was paying over like $1,300 a month for insurance back in Miami.
Health insurance,
to basically paying a quarter of that per every 3 months is kind of amazing. So, one of the things that I learned from other union actors is that they make sure and they get that out of the way first from the very beginning. So it's like, I'm constantly auditioning.
So in talking about health benefits, you do have to hit a minimum in order to be eligible for those, correct?
Yes, you do. And that's what went up a couple of years ago.
Right.
However, once you hit that minimum, it's amazing. And their health package is like nothing I've ever had. And I had really good health benefits, I thought, in Miami. These are better. They also have some great, the SAG AFTRA Foundation has some amazing webinars, and they're constantly teaching. And also for older actors, for dancers, they're constantly trying to get the message across of all the other parts of the performing arts industries, which I think is so helpful because, let's say you're a dancer and you are just maybe not wanting to work anymore or you can't work anymore. And so they have all sorts of webinars and workshops where you can learn about these things. And so there are some great benefits to SAG AFTRA. And again, I don't regret in the least having done it. It was just a place where I had to get to it. I had to grow into it.
Absolutely. And bosses out there, again, it's a personal decision. My career based on genres that aren't necessarily helped by being a union member, I am able to work and support myself. I think that with healthcare, that is something that you have to take care of yourself that isn't taken care of by SAG AFTRA. But again, with SAG AFTRA, you have to hit a certain amount of money that you're making in order to be eligible to utilize that benefit. So, great conversation, Pilar. I think that it's really great that we went through the history of it because I just vaguely remember, God, now I know I'm kind of getting old in this industry, that I vaguely remember I was in it before the merger and, how things happen and how things have evolved with how we get work and how we can now, with technology, there's all other avenues to get work for non-union people in terms of with the technologies and casting sites and pay-to-plays, and as well as how the union, I think, the union is struggling a little bit to keep up with the advances in technology. And that's just I think, organization like that has a lot of ground to cover. And I think that might be one improvement I've heard people talk about, that hopefully the union will get more with the times a little bit. And there was, I think, a couple of years ago, there were some people going on strike regarding the video games. And the union wants to make sure that their members are protected. So,
yeah. But their heart's in the right place. They're definitely on the right track.
I agree. I absolutely agree. So, bosses, lots to think about. We covered a lot of ground. Pilar, I totally appreciate your wisdom and your experience with all this because it's really, really helped me to see how it's evolved over the years and benefits and things that we might want to consider as we continue our journeys in our voiceover careers. So, thanks so much for that.
No, absolutely. Thank you.
Okay, guys, I'd like to give a great big shout out to our new sponsor, 100 Voices Who Care. This is your chance to use your voice, make an immediate difference, and give back to those communities that give to you. Find out more at 100voiceswhocare.org. And a big shout out to other sponsor, IPDTL. You too can network and communicate like a boss, like Pilar and I do every week. Find out more at IPDTL.com. You guys have an amazing week. We'll see you next week. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Join us next week for another edition of VO Boss with your host, Ann Ganguza. And take your business to the next level. Sign up for our mailing list at voboss.com and receive exclusive content, industry revolutionizing tips and strategies, and new ways to rock your business like a boss. Redistribution with permission, coast-to-coast connectivity via IPDTL.